The stories of black people and what black people have gone through must be told. They can't be limited to 1 month in the year, and they can't be reduced down to telling the stories that make us feel good. All parts of black history must be told, and that includes the painful and uncomfortable parts, the stories in history that some want to forget about. In this video, I want to talk about injustice against black women. This is something that is not often talked about, and it should be. Because when you look at the history of this country and what black people have gone through, black women have suffered just as much, if not more than black men, and their stories deserve attention too. I want to tell you a story about a black woman who endured tremendous brutality and pain at the hands of Jim Crow forces. I want to tell you her story so that her name and what happened to her are not forgotten. Before I get into her story, let me first give you some historical background. This is important to put in context what we're going to talk about in this video. So give me a few moments to break this down, and then I'll get into what happened to this black woman. Black women have suffered violence and injustice at every stage of their existence in this country. Slavery was sustained through what one historian calls institutionalized terror. Any perceived violation on the part of an enslaved black person was met with violence. The anticipation of violence was the slave master's most powerful weapon over enslaved black person. If you read the narratives of formerly enslaved black people, they are filled with violence that black people experienced. Enslaved black women were often on the receiving end of this violence. In her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs wrote about how she watched her mother, who worked as a cook on a plantation, being whipped or sometimes having food forced down her throat when the master or even the master's dog did not like the food that she cooked. We also learned a lot about the violence that black people suffered, and black women in particular suffered, during slavery from the Federal Writers Project. It was a New Deal program established during the Great Depression. It was a part of the New Deal's Works Progress Administration designed to provide employment for writers and researchers and other cultural workers. One of its most notable initiatives was the Slave Narrative Collection, which aimed to gather first-hand accounts of formerly enslaved black people. The project involved interviewing over 2,000 formerly enslaved black people between the years of 1936 and 1938. It's full of vivid descriptions of violence being inflicted on black women. A formerly enslaved black man named Jordan Jones recalled seeing a pregnant black woman whipped on the ground while her husband was forced to stand there and watch. A man named Alan Wilson watched his mother stripped and beaten with a leather strap. He was powerless to do anything. Annie Hawkins talked about how the slave master beat her grandmother to death for no reason at all. After slavery ended, things did not get better for black women, because after slavery came convict leasing, what is often called slavery by another name. Black people being arrested for petty crimes and sold back into slavery. In the expanded industrial empire of the New South, black convict labor became an indispensable commodity. Black women and black men worked individually and collectively in various grueling tasks, such as grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, building roads, digging ditches, smelting iron, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine and plowing fields, hoeing weeds and picking crops. And black female inmates also had the added burden of domestic service. They had to cook meals and clean camp kitchens and sew and launder soiled garments and work as the private servants of the wardens and other people in the penal institution. As we moved into the Jim Crow era, black women were not spared from lynchings and other horrors that were inflicted on black people. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I've talked about how there was a shift in the early 20th century from mob violence against black people to state-sanctioned violence against black people. Southern states began to create a monopoly on the use of force against black people. Police torture emerged as one of the primary tools of control, with officers routinely using physical and psychological coercion to extract confessions from black people. These confessions secured quick convictions and appeased the white community's demand for justice. The decline in public lynchings did not amount to a decrease in racial violence in the South, but rather a shift where the justice system assumed the role of the lynch mob. Black women suffered in this shift towards state-sanctioned violence, just as they had in previous eras of injustice against black people in this country. Alabama had a history of the police beating black women to get them to confess to crimes. In 1942, a black woman named Lily Mae Hendon was arrested and beaten by Macon County Sheriff Henry Fawcett after she was falsely accused of stealing $154. She was beat so bad that a white woman who saw her afterwards said that Lily's hips looked like battered liver. In 1946, another black woman named Martha McMillan was arrested by Bullock County Sheriff Joseph Pickett after she was falsely accused by a white family of stealing a ring. She was beaten with a 4-foot rubber hose to try to get her to confess. They beat her so bad that the hose broke into pieces. I cover her story more fully in another video, so check it out if you haven't seen it. This was the world that Mallie Pearson found herself in when she became the next black woman dragged into the monopoly of state-sanctioned violence against black people. Mallie Pearson was born Mallie Eddy in 1904 in Alabama to Marzine and Camilla Eddy. Her parents were likely the children of formerly enslaved black people. In 1920, when she was 16 years old, she married James Pearson. Together, they had 5 children. In April of 1953, Mallie and James lived in Halsell, Alabama in Choctaw County. Mallie was 50 years old. She was a homemaker and a midwife. Someone said that Mallie stole a bale of cotton from a local business. Now, I found this allegation interesting because a 1940 census record showed that Mallie and her husband James owned their own farm. They weren't sharecroppers. They farmed their own land. So she would have had no reason to steal cotton because her family likely grew it. On April 3rd, 1953, around 2 p.m., Sheriff Kervin Covington, Deputy Otis Glenn Wainwright, and Deputy Harry Leon Clark drove to find Mallie. When they found Mallie, she was with her husband James. They forced Mallie to get into their vehicle. Just like during slavery times, James was powerless to do anything. I can't even begin to imagine what he must have felt at that moment. These weren't just white men who came for his wife. They were white law enforcement. And like so many black people had done before him, he had to consider many things at that moment. He had to think not only about his wife's life, but also about his life and their children. If he acted the way he wanted to, would it cost him and Mallie their lives right there? And what would happen to their children? There was no one to help him or Mallie because those that were supposed to help them were the ones carrying out this injustice. Sheriff Covington and his 2 deputies drove Mallie out of town to a field between Halsell and Butler. They wanted to make sure that no one was around for what they were about to do to her. Mallie must have been terrified during this ride. This was a ride that many black people took, but not many made it back from. Once at the field, they told Mallie to get out. Mallie initially said no because she was scared. That's when one of the men hit her in the head with a piece of iron and forced her to get out of the vehicle. After this, the situation went from bad to horrific. The 3 white men then forced Mallie to lie on the ground on her stomach. Sheriff Covington then went to cut a branch from a tree. As he was going to get the branch, one of his deputies pulled off his belt and began to beat Mallie. He beat her on her buttocks and on her thighs. He hit her with all of his might and all of his strength. The other deputy then beat Mallie with a club. That's when Sheriff Covington returned with the tree branch. He joined his deputies and he too beat Mallie. These men beat and treated her like she wasn't even human, like she wasn't alive. Mallie lay on the ground as the men beat her to near death. As they were beating her, Sheriff Covington squatted down in front of Mallie and told her to tell them where she hid the cotton. Mallie screamed out in pain and said that she did not steal anything and didn't know what they were talking about. Sheriff Covington told Mallie that if she continued to scream, he would take that branch and ram it down her throat and cram dirt in her mouth until she told them what they wanted to know. But this was not the end of this Jim Crow horror show. The 3 white men then pulled up Mallie's dress and began to beat her more. They kept beating her as they tried to get her to confess to something that she did not do. The beating went on for an hour. Finally, after Mallie would not confess, they stopped the beating and released her. But they told Mallie that if she mentions a single word about what happened to her to anyone, they would take her life. The beating that Covington and Wainwright and Clark subjected Mallie to was so severe that she had to spend 4 days in a hospital in Meridian, Mississippi. Dr. Columbus Jackson examined Mallie. He said that Mallie was so weak and in so much pain from the beating that she couldn't stand and could only kneel. Mallie had severe bruising and marks on her flesh that indicated that at least 3 objects had been used to beat her. Mallie stayed quiet about what happened to her. Like many black victims of Jim Crow brutality, Mallie knew that there was no one to run to, no one to tell, no one to come to the rescue. So, like thousands before her, she kept her mouth shut, hoping that what happened to her before would not happen again. These men had almost taken her life, and they did not care that they had been seen in broad daylight kidnapping Mallie off the street. Mallie had to think not only about what happened to herself if they came back, but what would happen to her husband James or their children. Would they lynch James? Would they harm their kids? This is what Jim Crow did to black people. But somehow a local white pastor got word of what happened to Mallie, and he decided to report this incident to the FBI. Just a few years prior to this incident, the U.S. Justice Department created the Civil Rights Section to investigate incidents of police abuse and lawlessness in law enforcement. The Justice Department used old laws that were passed during the post-Civil War era that had been forgotten to invoke its authority to investigate and prosecute the Jim Crow law enforcement who are violating the rights of black people. I talked about this more in another video about a black teen named Quintar South, so I won't repeat all of that right here, but I do encourage you to watch that video if you haven't. It's about a black teen who was burned by police officers to falsely confess to a crime that he did not commit. His case was the first time in a half century that the federal government prosecuted someone for violating the rights of a black person. So when the FBI began investigating Mallie Pearson's case, they had a blueprint on how to prosecute Jim Crow law enforcement who violated black citizens' rights. When the FBI began investigating, they spoke to Mallie Pearson. FBI agent Robert Krongeier was one of the first agents assigned to Mallie's case. After speaking with Mallie about what happened to her, he brought Sheriff Covington and the two deputies to Mallie's home. Mallie positively identified Covington, Clark, and Wainwright as her abusers. Clark and Wainwright spoke to the FBI and denied having anything to do with Mallie. They said she was lying. Sheriff Covington refused to speak with the FBI. After investigating the case, the FBI determined that Mallie's civil rights had been violated by the sheriff and the two deputies. The FBI then passed along the case to the Justice Department for prosecution. On September 29, 1953, the federal grand jury indicted Sheriff Covington, Deputy Wainwright, and Deputy Clark, and charged them with violating Mallie Pearson's civil rights. If convicted, they faced 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. After being indicted by the grand jury, Sheriff Covington, Deputy Wainwright, and Deputy Clark surrendered to federal authorities. They were arraigned on October 14, 1953, where they each pleaded not guilty to the charges and were released on $1,500 bond. After court, when asked by a reporter about the case, Sheriff Covington said that he didn't know anything about Mallie's allegations other than what he read in the indictment. He pretended as if he was clueless about what was going on and why he was being federally prosecuted. This indictment was not a reason to celebrate. Even though the Justice Department was investigating and prosecuting sheriffs that violated black citizens' rights, the sheriffs were not being held accountable by white juries. The two black women I told you about earlier in this video who were beaten by Alabama sheriffs, those cases were prosecuted and the sheriffs were found not guilty. So federal prosecutors still had a long road ahead of them to hold Sheriff Covington and the two deputies accountable for what they did to Mallie Pearson. And the fear and terror that Mallie experienced did not end with the indictment of the three white men. Jim Crow forces continued to come against Mallie. She was a black woman in the Jim Crow South. No one cared about black people and what happened to them. And Sheriff Covington was a beloved figure in the community. He was a World War II hero, and after returning home from the war, he joined the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office where he served as deputy chief until he ran for it and was elected to the office of sheriff in 1950. Upon being elected, he named Otis Glenn Wainwright as his deputy. The community was not prepared to turn against their beloved war hero on the word of a black woman. Mallie was pressured by whites in the community to come forward and to say that she was lying and retract what she had said about the three white men. When that didn't work, they escalated their intimidation. Whites threatened to burn down her house if she insisted on maintaining her allegations against the sheriff and his deputies. But Mallie stood strong in the face of Jim Crow and those who wanted to silence her. She did not retract what she said. She did not say that she was lying. She continued to tell the truth. She continued to say that these three white men beat her down in the middle of a field for no reason at all. The federal prosecution of Sheriff Covington and deputies Wainwright and Clark was plagued with delays for more than a year. But finally, on September 16, 1954, the case went to trial at the federal court in Mobile, Alabama. Judge Daniel H. Thomas presided over the trial. The case was prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Alabama. It was headed by U.S. Attorney Percy Fountain. Now, he was no stranger to prosecuting law enforcement in Alabama who violated the rights of black citizens. In 1948, he brought a federal civil rights case against the sheriff of Clark County, a man named Jenkins Hill, and his deputy for beating 9 black people. One of the black people that the sheriff was accused of beating was a black woman named Mattie Lee Poe. Despite the evidence, the jury acquitted the sheriff and his deputy in that case. It was for this reason that the U.S. Attorney knew that he had his work cut out for him in convincing a white Southern jury to hold Sheriff Covington and his deputies accountable. At the trial, Mallie testified. She told the jury how the men beat her, how they took turns brutalizing her, how the beating went on for an hour. She talked about how she was humiliated and threatened. But it wasn't just her testimony against the sheriff and the 2 deputies. The 2 white doctors who treated her at the hospital Dr. Columbus Jackson and Dr. J.P. Tatum, they both testified that they personally observed the injuries that Mallie sustained as a result of the severe beating she received. The FBI agent who investigated and spoke to Mallie also testified. He told the jury that Mallie was confident in her identification of these three white men, and she did not hesitate when asked who harmed her. Other witnesses also testified on Mallie's behalf. Mallie's husband, James, and another black man named D.C. Coleman, they told the jury how they saw three white men take Mallie away. Three ministers, a neighbor, Mallie's relatives, her daughter, and her 78-year-old father all told the jury what they knew and what they saw. The prosecution also called a Halsell farmer named Norman Lewis, who testified that Sheriff Covington came to him and asked him if there was any way that he can get out of this federal prosecution and what he had done to Mallie. Sheriff Covington and the two deputies were represented by attorney D.R. Coley. His defense was two-pronged. First, he said that the charges were completely false. Second, he said that the prosecution of the sheriff was political. He said that the charges were trumped up by a political opponent. Attorney Coley said that the former sheriff of Choctaw County, a man named A.I. McCoy, was involved in the conspiracy to have Covington prosecuted as revenge for beating McCoy in the sheriff's race. He claimed that this investigation and prosecution was the cause of Sheriff Covington losing his re-election campaign for sheriff to a man named Kanye Littlepage. Attorney Coley also called 12 character witnesses to testify about how good of a person the sheriff and the two deputies were. This was a case that was made for the prosecution to win. There was a credible victim who was clear in her identification of the perpetrators and what they did to her. There were corroborated witnesses that testified to support her and confirm that they too witnessed her injuries and spoke to her about what happened shortly after the time of this incident. There were two white medical doctors who treated Mallie, a white pastor who reported this incident to the FBI for Mallie, an FBI agent who investigated the case. All of the evidence pointed towards conviction, but there was one elephant in the room that could derail everything, and that was race. This was a case about a black woman being beaten by white people and mistreated during a time when no one cared about black people being victims of police brutality or lynchings. Black pain and black trauma was quickly dismissed and justified in this era. After a day and a half of witness testimony, the jury began deliberations. The overwhelming evidence did not matter. The jury came back and found Sheriff Covington, Deputy Wainwright, and Deputy Clark not guilty of all charges. In a letter to the U.S. Justice Department, U.S. Attorney Fountain later wrote that everyone believed that the men were guilty, and the judge thought that there might be a conviction. That was until they heard rumors that the jury was not comfortable with punishing a white man for beating a black woman. Before I continue, I have to pause for a moment to explain something to you. Mallie Pearson's case and the acquittal of the three white men was a part of a larger battle for equal rights and white resistance to that battle that was occurring at the time. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued the landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This decision undid the unjust legal doctrine of separate but equal. School segregation was just one of the ways that the U.S. imposed a caste system on black people. Before Brown, 0% of black students attended a majority white school. However, almost immediately after Brown, a fierce backlash was seen by Southern whites. On one hand, Brown was great for black people. Segregation was beginning to crumble. But on the other hand, it made those who believed in the old way and the old unjust traditions, it made them fight harder to keep them and maintain the unjust way of life. Brown created greater resistance on the part of whites to racial changes. After Brown, Southern states reversed all racial reforms and moved more to the right. There was also a resurgence of the Klan in Alabama and in Florida and in South Carolina, where it had all but disappeared. The not guilty in the Mallie Pearson case was just one of many ways that some white Southerners resisted Brown and what desegregation meant to the Southern way of life that they value so much. Mississippi adopted a more stringent literacy test. Louisiana purged thousands of black people from voter rolls using laws that gave them discretion to expunge names for technical reasons. Mississippi also did the same thing. Black voter registration in Mississippi went from 22,000 to 8,000 in 1956. Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia all passed new laws making voter registration more difficult. And there's a lot more that I didn't talk about that happened. Here's the point I'm trying to make and what I want you to take away from what I'm saying. Mallie Pearson was a victim of racial injustice on two fronts. She was beaten, brutalized, and humiliated because of racial injustice. And then her abusers were never held accountable because whites were upset that legalized racial injustice and discrimination was being undone. It was too much for the jurors in Mallie's case. Returning the not guilty verdict for the sheriff and the deputies was a vote for continued racial discrimination in the face of a world that was changing before their very eyes. The men that beat Mallie Pearson were respected for the rest of their lives. They did not live with terror or shame or fear. They lived with dignity and honor, something they robbed Mallie of having for the rest of her life. They left her with pain and trauma and humiliation, and the knowledge of knowing that it didn't matter what they did to her because she was black. Her blackness said that she did not matter and they can get away with anything. Sheriff Covington died in November of 1998 at age 76. Deputy Otis Glenn Wainwright died in 1980 at age 57. Harry Leon Clark went on to run for sheriff himself in 1958. He won that election. The injustice he inflicted on Mallie Pearson and so many other black people was not an impediment to his success in life. It might have helped to fuel it. He remained sheriff until 1975. He died in 1985 at age 67. Mallie Pearson later moved to Ohio. She died in May of 1990 at age 86. Her husband James died in 1981. For 37 years, Mallie Pearson lived every day with the pain, trauma, shame, and humiliation that those three white men caused her. This is not something that you just get over or you forget about as time goes on. You think about this every day. That is what Jim Crow and racism did to black people. It robbed thousands of black people of their lives, and it has robbed millions more like Mallie Pearson of their dignity and their peace. That is why it is so important that we tell these stories. I want to know your thoughts on this video. Had you ever heard of Mallie Pearson, and how did it make you feel learning all that she went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.